Goal of financial management. So, in a corporation, and now we are just going to focus on the corporate form of business, stockholders are the people who own that corporation. But due to the separation of ownership and management, they are not the people who manage the company. So they're not directly making any business decisions. It's whoever manages that corporation. Stockholders participate in electing the board of directors, who in turn hire managers that represent the owner's interests. So, what should be the goals of the chief financial officer, CFO? If you think about it, the chief financial manager or officer should be making such decisions that would make the owners of the corporation whose interests he represents happy, right? And to make them happy, it makes sense to say that the CFO should be making such decisions that would be increasing the current value of shares of stock, making the current value, today's value, as high as possible. If you think about why that actually makes sense, is because the stockholders are only receiving the so-called residual money. They're the residual owners of the corporation, because they're getting their money, their dividends, right, on each share, after everybody else has been paid their dues. And by everybody else, we mean employees in the company, suppliers to the company, lenders who gave money to the company, the IRS, who is entitled to get taxes on corporate income, and so on. So the stockholders get only what's left. And so if what's left is a large amount of money, then it implies that everybody else who has stakes in the company, such as employees, suppliers, and so on, are also happy. Unfortunately, because the managers and the owners are, do not overlap, it's two different groups of people, there's something called an agency relationship, which has some problems. In general, agency relationship means there is a principal and there is an agent. Principal hires an agent to represent his or her interests. In the corporate setting, stockholders are the principal, and they hire managers or an agent to run the company and represent their interests. The problem is known as the so-called agency problem. It's a conflict of interest between the principal and the agent, between the stockholders who own the corporation and the managers who manage it. So why is there a problem? Why would there be conflict of interest? Let's say me, Professor Chernobyl, right? Who am I, a principal or an agent? Well, I have a job at Cal Poly. Cal Poly is the principal. It hired me. I become the agent. Why did Cal Poly hire me? To teach, or at least that's the main part of my job, right? So I was hired to teach for you guys. What may be a conflict of interest between Cal Poly and me? Well, I might want to get as high of a paycheck as possible and do as little work as possible, hypothetically, of course. And on Cal Poly's side, my employer, it's actually hypothetically something similar. Cal Poly wants to pay me as little as possible, hypothetically, and have me do as much work as possible, right? Of course, it's all kind of a joke, but you can probably think of similar situations in a workplace in general. So what are examples of conflicts of interest between the owners and the managers of a corporation. For example, the owners may want, it may be in the owner's interest that the company makes some big decision, but the managers are against it. For example, it's actually a known fact. If you look at the real life data on mergers and acquisitions, you would see that typically companies that are being acquired by somebody else, right after the acquisition, the stock price goes up. And so it makes sense that stockholders of the company that is being acquired should be in favor of this takeover attempt, right? Because their stock price will go up. It will make them richer, wealthier. But oftentimes the management would oppose the takeover. Or on the other side, the company that is the acquiring firm, right? Managers, again, if you look at the data on how companies acquire other companies, let's say their competitors, you would see that typically companies pay a premium, so more than what the other company is actually worth today. And that premium comes of where? Well, it kind of comes out of what the stockholders of the acquiring firm would have received as dividends, right? So the managers overpay to take over another firm, which reduces cash remaining for the owners of the acquiring firm, which is again an example of a conflict of interests. And you can think of other examples like corporate, managers buy corporate jets and other, make other expensive purchases, which are viewed as, just for themselves. They pay themselves high bonuses at the end of the year, things like that. But clearly, it comes at the corporate owner's expense. Are there any ways to, eliminate the conflict of interests, the so-called agency problem? Well, the managers and the stockholders' interests need to be aligned somehow. Are there any ways to do that? There are a couple of ways. For example, there may be job prospects for managers successfully pursuing stockholders' goals. So a manager might be hired and offered promotion, in a few years if the stock price goes up, which makes managers work harder to increase stock value in order to receive that promotion in the future. Another way this could be, the interest between the two groups of people could be aligned is to offer the managers a compensation that would include the base salary plus the so-called stock options. This is actually pretty complicated. It's beyond the scope of this class. But stock options are financial securities that are determined by how much stock shares are worth. And the idea is the higher the value of stock shares, the higher the value of those stock options that the managers might own, personally. And so again, it gives an incentive to the managers to work in the interest of the stockholders, make sure they make the right decisions that would result in an increase in stock price, which will then increase the value of their stock options that they can sell later after a few required, years of the waiting time, and benefit financially.